start with a really broad question, Sean, if that's okay, which is, I'd just like to learn where you got the idea for this film and how that might relate to your past work.
Well, I've been covering issues surrounding the climate crisis and global environmental issues for about 15 years, pretty much the entirety of my career, really. And this is really, this work from Cambodia is the latest chapter in that continued work. And I originally got the idea for this specific story back in 2019 when I came across a story about the forest fires that were happening in Cambodia. And I came across this just during my normal research. I was looking for stories in Southeast Asia, and I was looking for potential stories that had been underreported or not really covered. And I felt that Cambodia was a country that didn't really get very much attention in terms of what's happening with its forests. And so I came across this, it was actually a NASA article saying how the forest fires that were taking place during the dry season, which runs from January to March each year, were visible from space. And I just thought this was an incredible thing to think about. And for me, I'm obviously a photographer and filmmaker, so I'm always thinking visuals. How can a story come across visually? So when I read about the fact that these fires were so extensive, I thought, well, this must be a visual story that I could potentially cover. So I looked further into the story, and then I started to really learn more about some of the other challenges that Cambodia's forests are facing. I started to learn about the extent of deforestation in Cambodia, which is at the end of the film there's a couple of text slides which give you a little bit of context and information about the situation in Cambodia. And you'll have seen that over the past couple of decades, it's estimates. There are different estimates, but generally it's estimated that Cambodia has lost almost a quarter of its forests in the last 20 years. So looking at it from this perspective of the extent of the forest fires and the extent of the deforestation in general, I just thought that had a really amazing potential for a story that hadn't really been told. I thought when I embarked on this story in very early 2020, just over a year ago, other regions of the world were getting a lot more attention with regards to their forests. Obviously, Brazil gets a lot of attention. There were fires happening in North America, in Australia, but Cambodia was a country that was getting very little attention, I felt. So those are the kind of stories that I really look for, and those are the kind of stories that the Pulitzer Center tend to look for as well, those underreported stories that aren't being talked about in the media. So that's when I approached the Pulitzer Center to cover this story in late 2019, and then I was able to go to Cambodia to cover this story in the last week of January 2020, and I was there for a few weeks covering the story.
Thank you. And one thing you mentioned was that text at the end of the film, and one thing I noticed while I had watched before was that the speaker and the poem were both sourced as anonymous. And, as some viewers may have noticed, two of our panelists, Lang Ouch and Marcus Hardkey, are not with us tonight. And, in the past, they are considered activists for this work. They have been, targeted in their line of work for, defending these forests, as you wrote at the end of the film. And so, I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about that. When you're taking on this kind of work, are there steps you take to make sure you're protecting, the identity of people you work with, or, and if so, how do you do that?
Sure. Well, with this project, I spent most of my time in and around two wildlife sanctuaries in northern Cambodia. One wildlife sanctuary is called the Piepenburg Wildlife Sanctuary, which is a few hours north of Phnom Penh. And the second wildlife sanctuary is called the Prelang Forest, which is also north central Cambodia, runs mainly to the west of the Mekong River. And so throughout the 3 weeks, I embedded myself with some of the conservationists, some of the local activists, and people who were working really on the front lines to try to protect the remaining forests in Cambodia. So as you mentioned, yes, it's a very sensitive topic in Cambodia for a number of reasons, which we can talk a little bit more about in a while. But of course, the safety of the people that I work with and the people that I cover is obviously very, very important to me. So in this type of story, I would always very much make sure that the people that I'm working with, the people that I'm photographing are aware of who I am, of what I'm doing, about the potential for where the work may be published, that it will be published online with potentially international media outlets. So I'm always very clear with them that is the purpose of me being there, because then I give them the choice of whether they want to be photographed or not. And some people that I worked with wanted to be identified, or were happy to be identified, I should say, and some people weren't. And if they weren't, then of course I respected that decision and either didn't photograph them or photographed them in a way that their identity couldn't be revealed. So that's incredibly important when you're working in a place where that work could endanger those people. And of course, the people that I met and photographed are still in Cambodia. I'm not based in Cambodia. I just visited there for 3 weeks. So I have to be very aware that these people continue to live in Cambodia. And so I have to take every measure that I can to protect them and not use images of them if they don't want them to be used. So specifically with regards to my film, and you mentioned the people that I collaborated with on the film, when I was trying to think of how I wanted to tell this story about Cambodia, like many times when you embark on a story, on a project, on a reporting project, you never know 100% what you're going to see, who you're going to meet, how the story is going to develop. That's one of the interesting and exciting things about taking on a project, but also one of the nerve-wracking things, because you never know quite how it's going to pan out. But after I'd been in Cambodia for about maybe a few days, maybe even a week of my 3-week stay, I kind of knew the visual story that I wanted to tell. I'd had the idea of trying to shoot a film just with the drone, and that was a very new approach, and it was something that I was really trying to push myself creatively to see if I could tell a story just using the drone, because I felt it was a really interesting and a really exciting tool to be able to try to tell this story in a new way by showing that visual transformation of Cambodia's landscapes, which I hope is quite clear in the film. But that wasn't enough for me, because I personally feel that when you cover stories surrounding either the climate crisis or environmental issues, I think it's really important that you try, for me as whether you want to call me a journalist or a storyteller or a photojournalist, the label doesn't matter to me, but what I'm trying to do is trying to get my audience to connect to a story. So if I just presented a 5-minute story of just visuals flying over the forest and the transformation, it doesn't have anywhere near the impact as it does with that poetry. So that was an idea that I came up with while I was in the field, while I was trying to brainstorm ideas. And so through a network of contacts that I made in Cambodia, I was able to find some Cambodian writers that I could collaborate with. And again, for the reasons that we were just talking about, I can't, discuss any more about them, but they were crucial in providing that script and that story, really, because I also felt that as an outsider, as a visitor, I didn't really think it was completely my place to try to tell the story of how this transformation in Cambodia is affecting Cambodian people, because what do I know about the feelings of Cambodian people about this? I think, obviously we have to be very careful about representation, about being considerate of the people that we are photographing and trying to tell stories about. So I think it's really important to try to collaborate with people who live in the areas that you're telling stories about, so that you can have their input into the side of the story which you, as the reporter, don't have, as a visitor, don't have access to. So it's something I thought very long and hard about, and that's what led me to coming up with the idea about using Cambodian poetry. And I was really, really happy with the way that it came out, because the poetry just lends this much deeper emotional level to the story. And I think it just helps other people connect on a human level, because somebody on the other side of the world, whether it's in the US or in Europe or wherever, can watch that and they can listen to a human story about how it's affecting people on an emotional level, which I think we can all connect to. So that was really important for me, specifically with this project and this story.
Yeah, I particularly love that the line that talks about, a body without a soul, with that shot of, the trees that are in these very straight lines, and then you fade to, what was there before, or what will soon be, replaced by neat, orderly farmland. So I agree. I think that it brings, a level of connectedness to the film. And, I think what you said about including voices that are, part of this narrative is really important. And, for any aspiring filmmakers who are watching, I hope that they'll take that advice to heart, that sometimes as storytellers, we shouldn't be the only ones telling the story. And, perhaps there are and should be other voices involved. And yeah, I just think that's a really important point. So thank you for bringing that up. I also wanted to, go back to, you're talking about the challenge of what you conceptualize going in. The storyboard you've come up with in your head might not always be what you end up with. And I can imagine that's a bit of a challenge, going into something not exactly sure what footage you're going to come back with. Were there any other challenges you encountered in the production of this?
Well, yes, I mean, that process is very typical for I'd say all of the projects that I take on, because, as a photographer, you have to be there where the action is, so to speak. You have to be there on the front line to get those images, whether it's photographs or video. But before you go to a place, you have no idea really of what you're going to see, what you're going to experience, as I mentioned before. So my general process would be, and was on this project, was you just take it day by day. So you go day one, you just start shooting. You see what you see, you meet whoever you can, and at the end of those first few days when you're in the field, I would go back to where we were staying, I'd look at my footage, I'd take out my notebook, and then I would start to write down excuse me, in my notebook, the scenes that I'd captured on day one. And then day 2 and day 3, those first few days, I wouldn't put too much pressure on myself. I would just go out, let's just see what the situation is. Have I chosen the right place to come to? Do I need to change my plan? Because maybe I'm not in the right place that I thought I would be. Because especially for Cambodia, I'd never been to Cambodia before. So I'd done obviously months of research and chosen what I thought was the best places to visit, but you never know. So those first few days, you have to give yourself a little bit of grace and just see if it is the place that you thought it might be, if it has the visual potential really for a story. And luckily, I found when I was there in the first wildlife sanctuary that I visited, I'd really found myself on the front line, because I found myself in one of the areas that had been most affected by the forest fires, especially. So after a few days, I really was certain I'd come to the right place. And looking at my notebook and my shots that I'd been able to capture from the first few days, I was suddenly, you slowly are able to see a narrative, because you look at the shots that you've got and you can think, well, okay, those shots could work at the beginning of the film if I did it like this, and these shots might work at the end of the film. Okay, what can I put in the middle, and can I get those shots here, or do I need to go to another place to get those shots? So it's like a little puzzle that just slowly starts to appear to you, and you don't know which pieces are going to come to you first. And when they start to appear, only then can you start to think, okay, where can I find the other pieces to put together to make this bigger picture of the story? So really, you have to have faith in the process. You know, I've done this for many years now, and I've done many stories over the years. So I know the ebbs and flow that a story gives you, because when you're working on a story in the field for 3 weeks, say, so I'm literally working every day, pretty much dawn till dusk, working on the story when I'm in the field. My approach is quite intense in that respect. The story comes to you at a different pace. Some days you'll get lots of incredible footage, incredible pictures, you'll meet some incredible people, but then other days it'll be really quiet, and maybe you go to a place where there's nothing really happening, and the story, there's nothing there that adds to your story. You have to keep faith in the process. You have to go back, download your footage, log it, go to sleep, get a good night's sleep, wake up in the morning before dawn for the good light, and just do it again. Because you will, if you stick to the process, if you trust in the process, and you've done your research, and you've put yourself in generally the right places, you will get that luck, which means you will get those pictures and that footage that will eventually add up to a story. And that's the approach that I took with Cambodia Burning. As I mentioned, I embedded myself with these conservationists, so we did a lot of patrols going out into the forest, looking for illegal logging taking place. We were looking for forest fires that had been lit. So I was traveling with some of the local conservationists who were actually going out, trying to put out the fires. So we'd literally be on standby. So we might get a call, or I might get a call saying that there was a forest fire happening within a kilometre from the place that we were staying. It was literally that close. And so we would grab our equipment, and then we would jump in the back of a 4x4, and then we just race off into the forest, into the middle of the forest. And suddenly you'd hear this like a slow rumble, like a train was coming towards you. And then you'd look across or through the trees, and just 100 meters away, there'd be a 10-foot wall of fire coming through the forest. And the conservationists would jump out. They'd have huge tanks of water, and they'd go out just straight towards the fire to try to put it out. And so obviously my job there is to try to cover that, and so you can't get away with that. For the stills, I have to be very up close with the people doing that. So some of the photos that you'll have seen in my work were really right there on the front lines with the conservationists who were trying to, say, put out those fires. I can use the drone, obviously, to shoot from a safe distance, but for stills, the on-the-ground stills, I have to be there with them. And similarly for the illegal logging, there was a trip that I made into the Prey Lung forest, which we mentioned before, where we went out for 3 days on patrol. And in that instance, I went out with a group of about 20 local conservationists who are a part of a community network. So it's mainly made up of local people, local farmers and citizens who live on the edge of the forest, and they go out in patrols to monitor illegal logging. So for that patrol, we were camping in the forest for a couple of nights, and we were on motorbikes traveling through the forest, completely unmarked trails, and looking for evidence of illegal logging, which we found. So, you know, logistically, those instances are quite challenging, but that is the only way to make sure that you are with, you know, the right people who are doing these incredible things, trying to either stop the forest fires or try to monitor illegal logging. And so as a photographer and filmmaker, that's where you have to be. You have to be with those people and try to tell their stories as best you can.
I mean, yeah, I've seen those photos and some of those shots where, I mean, I can imagine you felt some of that heat. And I'm just curious how, you know, you talk about doing your research going in and, you know, making these connections with the conservationists, but how did you personally prepare to, you know, keep yourself safe or, you know, your equipment safe? I know a lot of photojournalists care a lot about, you know, taking care of that equipment as well. So just curious how you manage that in the midst of, you know, making sure you got that shot, as you said.
Well, to be honest, it was the first time that I'd experienced something like that. I hadn't really photographed fires like that before, so that was my first experience. And I very vividly remember the first time when the call came out that there was a fire nearby the place that we were staying, literally within maybe half a kilometer to a kilometer away. And so we, like I mentioned before, we jumped in the car and raced out there. And that first experience was nerve-wracking. I won't lie, but you know, I was with the conservationists who do it so regularly that it was a case of, okay, this is the job that we have to do. You know, out of the car, water on their backs, straight towards the fire. And, you know, that kind of snapped me out of my temporary moment of experiencing that for the first time. You know, I think it's a very natural thing because, you know, most of us don't put ourselves in those type of situations where there's that kind of situation taking place. So after you have that momentary moment of surprise or almost even fear that you're going to put yourself in that type of situation, you know, I have to switch that, you know, professional side on because I'm there to do a job. I'm there to tell a story. I'm there to tell their story. So, yeah, you just switch into a mode where you're there to do a job, and that's why you're there. So, of course, you know, I'm there not on my own. I'm there with other people, other professionals who are experienced. So in those situations, I always, you know, look to them for both advice, but also if there is potential dangerous situation that we might be getting into, I look to them for, you know, the advice if we need to do something, if there's, you know, a situation that I'm not prepared for or I'm not experienced in. If they say, okay, we need to leave now, then I listen to them and I do what they say because they're the professionals in that situation. And that happened specifically in one situation where we were in the Prey Long forest, which was the second half of my trip, where we were looking for examples of illegal logging in the Prey Long forest. And we came across a really large logging operation that the activists that I'd been with had been visited before. And they'd told me lots of stories about how they'd been intimidated and harassed by the workers within this logging operation, who obviously don't want what's happening there to be highlighted. And so we visited that operation towards the end of our trip, and to be able to photograph that, what we did is we traveled to a little bit of a safe distance away from the logging operation. And then I used my drone and flew it over the logging operation. And a lot of the footage that you see in the film, the footage of all the trucks and all the logs that are lined up, all cut, that's all that footage. And to do that, the activists warned me and said, look, we've got to do this quickly because we're going to draw attention. So I listened to them, and I just waited to get their kind of indication that we'd been there, if we'd been there too long. So, I managed to fly my drone there for about maybe 15 minutes, shot some video, got some stills, and I was happy with that. And I was flying the drone back, and some of the activists said to me, look, we've got to go. We think people are coming from the logging operation. They'd obviously seen my drone. That was inevitable. And so by the time I'd got my drone back and I'd landed it, then the people from the logging operation had started to get quite close. And so we all jumped on the motorbikes, and we started to, speed away on the motorbikes, and the people from the logging operation gave chase. They followed us, but we managed to get away. So it was, a little bit of a nervous situation for everybody, because nobody wants to be in that type of situation. But again, being able to get that footage and those photos, that's probably the first time that that's been done in that area. And to be able to use that footage to, really vividly show what's happening. I mean, there's no escaping those visuals that I was able to capture. That's been a really central part to the story, and having, that clear evidence about what's happening there. And so, a few of these situations might be deemed risky, but I don't think it's anything really for me compared to what some of these people are doing every day. And they're doing it, today, this week, this month. People in Cambodia, and all around the world. There are so many stories these days about environmental defenders around the world who are, really putting everything on the line to defend different ecosystems around the world. And I just did it for a short amount of time, but a lot of these people are doing it every day.
Yeah, very real reminder of, the longevity of these issues after we watch these documentaries. And I do want to remind people that if you're just tuning in a little late, we do have Sean's work on our website, pulitzercenter.org, and where you can, read more and watch more and learn about this, because, as always, there's more to learn about this topic. And I did want to, I don't know whether you expected to be pursued by folks with the logging operation, but aside from that, was there anything else that surprised you in this process?
A lot of it was a surprise, really. I mean, every project is unique. Every story is unique. But I think I was surprised. I was really surprised at the level of the deforestation and the intensity of how extensive the fires were in Cambodia. The situation was actually worse than I expected. So that was the thing that surprised me the most. I mean, sometimes you go and report on the story and it's maybe you don't feel visually it's as bad as perhaps some of the research or other articles you've read about the story. You know, perhaps those stories represented the issue in a different way than you expected. But for this story, the biggest surprise was that it was worse than I expected, sadly. So, like I mentioned, I was lucky that I managed to choose the places that were really being both badly affected by the forest fires and deforestation. And so by putting myself in those places, I mean, literally from day one, from when I arrived in Siem Reap in the north of Cambodia and then traveled to the first wildlife sanctuary, there were fires along the road. For day one, literally the afternoon that I started, I was already jumping out the car, shooting, both with my camera and the drone. And so I thought, wow, I mean, if this is day one, then what's going to happen over the next 3 weeks? And actually, the first day was nothing compared to some of the other things that I witnessed throughout those few weeks. So, and I think for this project, and out of most of the projects that I've done, this was probably the one of the projects that really, where the situation was much worse than I expected.
Interesting. We have a question from Abigail in the audience who is curious, and I think this might be a good wrap-up question as we're getting to the end of our time. But she wants to know if reporting the story has led you to any other stories or inspired you to pursue something similar or maybe completely different. I'm curious as well, you know, to know what you're working on next. Not to rush you, but you know, always curious to see what's up next.
Well, I think every story that I cover leads into another story. I mean, they're all really part of a chain of stories. Like I mentioned, my work covers a climate crisis and global environmental issues. So I'm always looking at how stories can connect to one another. And actually, if you look at all my stories as a whole, you can see that it's all just part of one large story. It's all about the climate crisis and how humanity is treating the earth. It's just one story. And my individual stories are all smaller stories that are just a part of that one larger story. And so what I do try to do is I try to connect the dots between those stories. Because I've covered environmental issues for such a long time, I feel that I'm in a better position now in that I can connect what's happening in Cambodia, say, with what's happening maybe here in China or with what's happening in North America. I can try to help my audience understand that these stories aren't actually different stories. They're all just these small stories that are part of one bigger story. And so each story kind of almost falls into the next story. And for me, because my work focuses mainly on the Asia Pacific region, Cambodia was one area that I wanted to cover. So I went out specifically looking for stories there. And so next, it's a little bit difficult to say what I want to do next because of the way the world is at the moment. It's difficult. For me, I do a lot of travel, obviously, on these stories. So we're quite limited with everything that's been happening in the world. But, you know, things are starting to change. So I will just be, you know, looking further into stories here in Asia. I'm, you know, really interested in filmmaking. So I have ideas about longer form documentary filmmaking, which I'm looking into, especially surrounding these type of stories in the Asia Pacific. So that's probably the area that I'll go into next in the next year or so, I would think.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sean. And I can't believe we're already almost out of time. I just wanted to say thank you again for taking time out of your morning to speak with us. And it's been a really wonderful conversation. And it was great to rewatch your film, and I can't wait to share it around and also see what comes next from you. It's always great. And I also want to thank my colleagues at the Pulitzer Center and our partners at EFF for their support in planning this. It's always a pleasure to participate in this festival, now virtual, of course, but I'm really glad we get to connect. And of course, we also appreciate everyone in the audience for joining us today. And for those of you who are able, remember that the Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism organization, and so we do depend on your support. Please consider donating today and becoming a Pulitzer Center champion. And of course, again, please check out pulitzercenter.org/events for more information on upcoming events like this one. Again, thank you for being with us today, and we hope you'll join us again soon.